What happens when we create machines that are as or more intelligent than we are? What are the possible timelines, implications, and ways forward to ensure that we create the most positive future possible for our world? In this first sequence on timelines, we're looking at how these machines might be built and when that might happen. In later episodes, we'll dig more deeply into the implications of AGI or artificial general intelligence and how we can work to ensure they work to benefit our world. This is the AGI show, and I'm your host, Soroush Paul. I'm here today with Alex Browne, a really good friend of mine. We worked together for a very long time at a company called Plaid, and we've even co-founded some companies together. Alex is one of the most talented software engineers I've ever worked with, and I really mean that very sincerely. He's an incredibly talented software engineer. And for the last 2 years, he's been focused on machine learning and data projects, including large language models, which that's the type of model for those listening that's used in things like GPT-3 and ChatGPT. So it's a very powerful type of model, as well as he's also worked on synthetic data approaches to learning, and he's done work for companies including Google, amongst others. Alex is deeply thoughtful also about all things impact and ethics, most recently starting a foundation to lower barriers and increase access for underrepresented minorities to get into STEM via things like scholarships, summer programs, and other initiatives. So you can see between the combination of his great software skills, ML knowledge, and his big focus on positive impact and ethics, why he might be the perfect person to have on the show. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Soroush, and thanks for the kind words, and thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
Absolutely. No, we're really excited to have you here. So I think we'll just dive right into the things that people are interested to hear about. So we'll just start with, I want to hear a little bit about you, Alex, so the listeners know about you, and specifically your work in the software field and most recently ML.
Yeah, sure. So my background is mostly in software engineering. I've been working as a software engineer for over a decade at a variety of different companies. And most recently, over the past 2 years or so, have shifted to focusing on machine learning, data science, and artificial intelligence. I still mostly approach things from a software engineering or an ML engineering perspective. So that means I might not know about the ins and outs of the underlying models, although I do know a little bit and I can speak about that. Mostly, I view these models as tools that I can use to meet specific product needs or do specific tasks. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Absolutely, and I would say argue that that's how the whole world's looked at these things up until this point. Rightly so, they've been
Sure.
pretty specialized tools. So we'll see what's coming next, but that makes a lot of sense to me. So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on this show today is because I know you have a more measured view of some of the current abilities and the future of AGI. And I also think you have quite a positive one as well, how these things can be applied for good things. So I really wanted to bring a bit of balance into the show. There's really big different perspectives in this. When it comes to current existing artificial intelligent models, the kind of the state of the art for general tools in particular, not so much super specialized ones, but more general ones. I'd love to understand from your perspective, what do you think the current capabilities of existing models are and their limitations as well? Where are they at today?
Yeah, so there's a lot that I could talk about here. I think that maybe I have a little bit of a unique perspective since I've been working with models like GPT-3 and other large language models in production settings at a time where everything is still fresh and new, and there's not a lot of people that are doing that. So I can talk about some of the specific strengths and weaknesses of models like GPT-3 in the context of doing things in production and serving customers. So one of the things that I did in the past year or two is we're working I worked for a consulting company that does ML and data science consulting. And we had a client that wanted to process surveys, mostly medical surveys. So they would ask patients about specific drugs and treatment options, and a lot of older patients. So in the responses, and in particular in the free response questions, where the patients were allowed to basically say anything that they wanted, a lot of the patients are older and they tended to kind of ramble or use the wrong words to refer to things. And we tried a lot of different approaches to parse and understand survey responses.
And by understand here, you mean something like get an understanding of the semantic meaning, like the actual meaning of what they're
Yeah,
saying, or the emotions involved, things like that.
yeah, exactly. So one of the simplest things that we did was sentiment classification. So just like, are they speaking generally positive or negative
Yep.
about
Yeah.
this drug or treatment options? But we also wanted to do more complicated things like pick out key points that are common across responses. So if patients are mentioning specific side effects or specific concerns, and we see the same thing come up, we're the ones who wanted to identify that and kind of synthesize that knowledge together.
Yeah. And how did it go?
So what we decided to do was to use GPT-3 for this task after testing a couple different solutions, and it performed surprisingly well. And again, keep in mind, like these are responses that have both a lot of technical jargon and a lot of rambling, where patients go on and like, I picked up my daughter from whatever, and just like talk about stuff that is not relevant.
And when you say it
And
went well, what does that mean in this context? You were able to get, detailed meaning that would have taken a long time for a human to do? Is that kind of what we're talking about?
yeah, exactly. And it still wasn't perfect. So I think the way I would describe it is like as a first pass. Um, so the solution that we ended up building for the client would take these responses and do uh, a first pass of sentiment classification, identifying key points, stuff like that. And we would also give the client a confidence score. So we would say, oh, the model is really confident that this is positive.
Mm-hmm.
Or we would say, oh, this is a mixed sentiment, and maybe have like a lower confidence. So
Mm-hmm.
then we would still require a human to go in and kind of like weed out and fix up the answers that the model was not as confident about.
That's
But still,
interesting. Yeah.
it was a big acceleration for their workflow, because all of a sudden you can like confidently classify and parse 85% of responses, and then just leave like the last 15% for a
Well,
human to
and
go in and double check.
what you just talked about in terms of having the human in the loop for some number of them with lower confidence is actually a very like a very much a solution to a common problem people talk about with AI systems is what if they get it wrong? What if they, so if the system has any sense of I could be wrong or some greater chance of predicting that, then we can help account for those issues with this sort of system.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that the near-term future for models like and even like generative art models, which I've also worked with a little bit, things like Stable Diffusion and Dolly. I think the near-term future is going to be humans and AI working together, or at the very least, humans doing some oversight and some double checking of things.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And I know that we've spoken a little bit about the fact that you've been using, is it GitHub Copilot specifically? Is that the
Yeah,
tool?
yeah.
Yep. It's a pretty great effect. And like I said earlier, I do consider you one of the best software engineers I've ever had the pleasure of working with. So when someone of your caliber says it's useful, that means a lot to me. I'd love to understand how are you using it? And if you had to estimate, say, the gains in productivity in any way, and maybe a metric would be nice. Is it like you're able to do things faster, and then how much faster, or higher quality and how much better quality? I'd love to understand that. I'm sure lots of listeners would be pretty curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been generally very impressed by Copilot so far. I've been using it on a daily basis as I work on a side project of mine, which is a game that runs in your browser and teaches you programming,
Mm,
targeted towards middle school and high school kids. Um,
awesome.
so this game uses a lot of different programming languages and a lot of different frameworks, and it's something that I'm working on my own right now. And so being able to use Copilot to uh, generate test cases, like handle some of the more menial tasks, and even sometimes just like write complete functions if they're relatively simple. It consists of like 5 or 10 lines of code. I've been very impressed with it so far, and I think uh, it definitely speeds up my coding process quite a bit. Of course, it's not perfect, and in particular, so I'm doing some work with Rust, and it will sometimes generate Rust code that doesn't compile, and
Mm.
usually because it doesn't pass the type checker.
Right.
And it's
That's
kind of
so interesting. It's like
yeah,
one of those things that the older, more regimented systems, computer-based tools have been really good at. It's like, basic things like static analysis. But now you've applied this more general human-like, not human-like is a bit strong, but you know what I mean, a more less rules-based cognition. It now fails to do the basic stuff.
yeah, it's kind of funny. And I mean, to be fair, Rust has a rather complicated type system.
Yeah,
So it is kind of understandable how it would get
sure.
some things slightly
Sure.
wrong. The good thing is that, like, usually, even if it does generate some code that is slightly wrong, it's at the very least like a good starting point. So yeah.
And Alex, I'm curious, just so I and others can get a sense. If you had to estimate the speed up and do it over, averaged out, obviously it's not going to be over one task, which could be instant versus not instant. But let's say you're doing a project that would have normally taken you 1 month to code up, let's say, and we're only looking at the coding portions. What do you think the speed up might be here?
Yeah, I guess for me personally, it's been somewhere on the order of like 1.5x to 2x.
Wow.
And it's that way in particular because I'm working with a lot of new frameworks that I might not be
Mm,
as familiar with.
mm.
And so basically any time where I would have to take a step back, stop coding, and look something up in Google in a
Look at
separate window.
documentation or, yep.
Yeah, look at documentation. There's a lot of cases where Copilot can help skip those steps and just kind of give me the code that I need, or at least close enough to the code that I need.
That sounds incredible. And for someone of your caliber, and I understand that it is context specific, but to be able to say something like 50% plus boost in productivity is really crazy. And then I also think about, yeah, obviously these systems are getting better. And we, as our generation of software engineers, we haven't even been trained on this stuff. I wonder, even just the current state of the AI, but you just get better at the how to use it and integrate it better into development environments, what that will look like. So I know you've been a little you've wanted to kind of talk to me about kind of where you think current systems are when it comes to more general intelligence beyond kind of these targeted use cases. And this raises questions like, are these systems sentient? And I know some people really get really quite polarized about hearing that word in the context of AI, but I think it's a fascinating topic and a relevant one. But I'm just curious, more generally, if you think about how you consider these systems from a general intelligence perspective. Sentience is one aspect of it, but just more generally, what do you think about how generally intelligent these current systems are?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the answer is really complicated as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think, well, I guess also at this point, I should probably go ahead and say I want to hedge my bets in terms of what I say with AGI and where we're headed, and especially around timelines, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Mm.
So I'm going to throw in some head words, like in my experience, this is what I think. But
That's
even if
okay.
I forget,
I appreciate the head words.
that's
I think we've got too many people. Like one of the things I was thinking about the other day was people throwing out things like we will have a 50% chance by this year, and I was just
yeah,
thinking to myself,
yeah.
the false precision. It's like, how did you? It's what percentage? And oftentimes it is just like in a conversation that you just come up with it. So anyway, a few hedge words,
Yeah,
a
for sure,
few
for sure.
little bit of avoiding false precision is something I appreciate from you.
Yeah, and even if I forget going forward and say something that's more certain, just keep in mind, like I really don't want to pretend to be certain, and sometimes there's not an absolute answer at all. So yeah, just want to get that out there. Um, so regarding AGI and sentience and where we're at with current models, I
Hmm.
think, in my opinion, the capabilities of things like Chat GPT and GPT-3 um, are not. I wouldn't call those models sentient,
Hmm.
and I don't think they would meet the definition of what most people uh, uh, the definition that most people use for AGI.
Hmm.
And there's some specific reasons for that and some specific shortcomings. Um, I think the most concise definition of AGI that I've heard, and I'm curious if you have
Yeah.
your own thoughts or your own definition as well, is that AGI, an AGI system or an AGI model is capable of doing most or all of the economically useful work that a human could do. Um,
Yeah, I
what
think
do you think about that?
yeah, I think so. I was thinking about this the other day. I think, looking at the word literally, I would say it's, artificial intelligence that just is more generally capable rather than in a very narrow way. That's, I think, the literal reading of that word. But I think the way most people use it is that it is able to do most or all or more than human beings, at least in a really wide range of fields. And right now, obviously, these systems don't have physical embodiments; they don't have physical systems. So usually, we're just talking about in the kind of thinking realm or information realm. But I think
Yeah, yeah,
what you said it roughly aligns with how most people use that word.
cool. Um, so when looking at something like GPT-3, uh, it can today probably replace some economically useful work that humans are doing.
Yes.
Um, at the very least, it is an accelerant for work that humans are doing. And I talked about two specific examples of that with Copilot from our own personal experience, and then some of the work we were doing for a client with medical surveys.
Hmm.
So I think that's pretty clear that today AI is accelerating the rate at which humans can work and be productive. And what's even more fascinating is that uh, GPT-3 can do things that it was never explicitly trained to do. So they didn't train GPT-3 to parse medical surveys, and they didn't train it to uh, suggest code per se.
I think
Really,
in the context of Copilot, maybe they added more
it's
data
true
on
that
it.
there's a little bit of fine tuning happening for Copilot. That's true. So maybe it's not the best
Yeah.
example.
But it's
Um,
look, I mean, and that's also just to be clear to make the comparison fair. We do that for humans. We don't throw them into a job and go, "Good luck." We go, "Here's
sure,
some
yeah.
onboarding, here's some training. What degrees do you have?" So we obviously do so-called fine tuning or additional training for humans too.
Sure, yeah, yeah, that's true. But I was trying to say, even for tasks where you don't do any fine tuning, GPT-3 is quite capable. And in the original
Mm.
paper describing GPT-3, OpenAI talks about zero shot and one shot tasks, where so GPT-3 has a text-based interface. So the way you interact with it is by giving it a prompt, and it will try and complete the prompt. And what you can do is in your prompt, you can say things like classify this tweet as positive or negative and just give it a short sentence. And you format it in a certain way, like tweet colon, and then you put the tweet, and then you put sentiment colon, and it will predict with pretty high accuracy like what's the sentiment of that tweet. And it can do that in spite of the fact that they never trained GPT-3 with the explicit goal of doing tweet classification. But I do think these models have a lot of limitations. Fundamentally, what GPT-3 does is it's a pattern recognition engine. So
I do love when this. Sorry to jump in, but I do love when people say this, because I also there's a follow-up question of, are humans pattern recognition machines? But let's stick with the levels for now.
I think that is a big part of human intelligence, but I don't think it's the only part.
Sure, absolutely agree with that.
True. And anyways, what they've done is they trained GPT-3 on a massive corpus of text, which basically all text on the internet, more or less, was included in training. Billions and billions and billions of lines of text. And what happens is the model starts to recognize patterns, and even patterns that are really complicated. So when you ask it in the prompts, can you do this task? It's sort of relying on its corpus and existing examples where people posted stuff on the web and said something similar. Maybe on a forum like Stack Overflow, where somebody says like, "Hey, I'm trying to do this," and Copilot in particular, I'm sure draws a lot from
so that kind of website. I definitely agree with that, and there are lots of examples where that's the case. And in fact, sometimes I wonder how close the output is to something on the internet.
Sure, yeah.
But because of this potential kind of way of seeming intelligent without being intelligent, I've definitely personally gone off and tried to give really specific questions that just don't exist on the internet, right? And it works. I'll say things like, I've got 3 friends in this location, and we're doing this, and we went to this school, and lots of something that will require originality, and you get really good results. And for me, that's actually very similar to humans, right? What's the quote in art? Like, there's nothing original or something like that. There's no original art. It's like all just remixes and slight tweaks on what exists. And I think in that sense, this can still be cognition, even if it's relying on a corpus of human creation.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I don't want to discount what GPT-3 and also things like ChatGPT are doing, because it is really impressive and it is really sophisticated. I'm just trying to frame it this way and talk a little bit about what's going on under the hood, because it also kind of helps us understand what are the limitations.
And maybe what we can do is because it's probably worth calling out. We've called out some of the wins. Like we've probably both seen some examples where it doesn't work. I'll call out one, and I'd love for you to call out a couple as well.
Sure.
One that I've already noticed is there seems to be something fundamentally broken still in some sort of symbolic reasoning. So you can ask it really basic, like primary school, elementary school stuff around, I've got 3 balls, John's got 2 balls, Sally's got 4. How many Dewey balls do we have together? And it will just completely can't do basic addition once there's these kind of symbolic things. And it makes sense because it can't just connect. It doesn't have the freedom of a creative thing where, correctness actually is clear cut here. And it clearly doesn't pick up on all the semantic aspects of it. So there's something kind of falling over there when it comes to the symbolic reasoning in that context. I'm curious what kinds of failures examples of explicit failures.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I mean, one thing that I was going to say, very closely related, is that Chat GPT, because I spent like an hour or so playing around with it just yesterday. It seems to really not understand math in general. It can do some simple things because if you like add two numbers together and it's like 2 or 3 digits, that's totally fine because chances are that those numbers exist somewhere in its corpus and it understands like how to add them together. But if you try and ask it to do like long division, for example, I got some really interesting and just drastically incorrect results.
Hmm.
And these are the kinds of questions you could ask, like a 10-year-old or something, like somebody in elementary school,
Yeah,
and they would be
yeah,
able
yeah.
to not only do long division, but show you like step by step how to do it, probably. And yeah, at one point I had Chat GPT tell me when you multiply two numbers together, the product is always smaller than the original two numbers. This is what it said. And I was like, hang
Wait a minute.
on.
Yeah, I've seen a few examples of this, which I would describe as simply as madman's logic, where you
Yeah,
read the sentences and they're very coherent, and it's like it sounds like a really smart person said something, but it's just wrong, in any human way of looking at it.
yeah,
Andrew Ung had a really good example of this on LinkedIn, and it also shows the suggestibility of these models. So it was a really funny one. It was really simple. It was like, why are CPUs better than GPUs for training models or for a certain type of computation? And it gave a really good answer. Then it said, why is DNA programming better than GPUs for this type of computation? And he gave a pretty good answer. I mean, a bit debatable maybe, but like it was reasonable. Then he goes, why are abacuses better than GPUs for calculating this thing? And it was obviously it's not. The GPUs are far better. And he just like kind of like
yeah,
very sensibly was like, this is why an abacus is better because it's mechanical. And it's like, wait, that logic doesn't follow. So we just something about the suggestibility or the coherence, like it's coherent but wrong, was an interesting outcome.
yeah, yeah. That's a funny example. I hadn't heard that one, but I'm not surprised by it either.
Mhm.
We encountered actually these kinds of problems when I was working for clients, and had to like figure out ways to work around them in some cases. But yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Like the things that GPT-3 and Chat GPT spit out are always cohesive. Like they have proper grammar, they kind of make sense. And then when you start to look closely, like the details are wrong. And it's almost more dangerous that it's like that
I
because,
completely agree. It's definitely more dangerous that way. If it was Babel, you can
yeah,
ignore it more quickly.
yeah, exactly. Like if you're asking about a topic that you truly don't know about, I think it would be sometimes hard to understand if the information that you're getting back is accurate or if it's something that the model basically hallucinated, like made up, which does happen sometimes.
I want to look a little bit into the future. No technology is static. Certainly one as new as this one. Where do you think we're headed with these systems? And I'd love to ask, like the big focus for me, and I think many of our listeners, is more on the medium and the long term. Not so much. I mean, it's great to understand the applications of the current models, but I think what we're more interested in, where is this headed over a longer time frame, so we can understand particularly how to make those things very beneficial for our future. So, what are your thoughts on where these things are headed?
Yeah, that's also a really good question and something that I need to really hedge words on, um,
Yeah.
because I think that I can make some somewhat confident predictions about what we'll see in the next year or two. Um, and just I know you mentioned it's not like what you're super interested in, but just to mention some brief examples,
Sure,
like
go for it.
I think so. GPT-4 is probably going to come out, something that OpenAI has kind of hinted at recently. which will bring improvements. And I'm personally really curious to test it out and see if it addresses some of the shortcomings that we were talking about. We'll probably start to see text to video models become much more powerful.
Yep.
We're really just in the early days of that kind of research.
So we'll see. We'll see
like
if this podcast is we'll just do it over a chat. We'll just ship it to YouTube right afterwards.
Yeah, I mean that might be something that happens in the near future, especially if you allow yourself to have some artifacts and some things that are slightly off. So beyond that, I think it becomes really, really hard to predict. Because if you're talking about like a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year timeline, there's just so many things that could change. And even looking in the past, like 5 years ago, I don't think that even AI researchers that were deep into their field would predict that we would have something like GPT-3 and ChatGPT, or something like Dolly or Stable Diffusion in the time frame that we actually got those models.
That's a really interesting one, because I've been thinking a lot about that exact point, about how experts look at this versus maybe non-experts, or at least semi-experts. And I think that is true that many experts didn't, but it's funnily enough, I think there were also many people that did predict this stuff. I read Nick Bostrom book, 7-8 years ago, and he was talking about not so much the pathways and the specific years, but certainly some of the possibilities. And I know I have a lot of good friends in the technology industry who saw it. We've been wrong on other things, like the classic example is self-driving cars. So certain things have been harder to really nail. And I hear your point about not being able to predict it. I don't think anybody here should claim that they can predict 5, 10, 20 plus years into the future. But I think it is important that we try for really practical reasons. The biggest one for me being ensuring a beneficial future, right? Some of these things that we want to dig into and get answers to will take time and will require foresight. So I'd still love for you to try anyway. What are some of the things where this stuff could be heading in a longer time frame, even if we're wrong?
Yeah. So let's see. I think some things that would need to happen between now and ultimately something that could rightly be called AGI is so the models that we have today, while impressive and fairly broad in terms of what they can do, and that includes doing tasks that they were never originally trained to do, they're still somewhat limited. So for example, GPT only understands text. It has no way to understand other kinds of input. It also has no way to learn new things without undergoing additional training from and when I say training, I mean like from a modeling perspective. Like you can't just.
It's not It's not an autonomous agent in that regard.
Yeah.
Like, it needs to be given the data typically in some way.
Yeah, exactly, and that requires today a lot of human intervention and a lot of careful designing of the training task and
Not to mention
data.
a gargantuan amount of compute time.
Yeah, and a gargantuan amount of compute time.
Yeah.
So I think that's important to keep in mind is that like to get to AGI or to get to sentience, we need some new capabilities that don't really exist today. At least when we're talking about models like GPT or Stable Diffusion or Dolly. And what might happen is that we start to run into limitations of the technology that we have. So I think I mentioned to you before, like we might run into hardware limitations with silicon. We're already getting pretty close to the limit of how small you can make transistors and how densely you can pack them together. So what that means is we can always scale by throwing more chips and more machines at the problem. But when you do that, you're running up against economic and ecological limits. So we might reach
Sure.
the point where training a model to do better than GPT-4 or GPT-5 down the line, it would just take, like trillions of dollars or something, like something that we just can't easily do.
We can't just hand
Um,
over the the GDP of the US to this.
yeah. So
So
we
are
might start
you,
running into those
yeah,
kinds of limits.
that makes sense. So hardware limitations start to come up. If you, if we think about, let me ask you a simple question that will help us work backwards. Do
Sure.
you think, do you think in the coming decades we can get to that kind of general intelligence? Can we get to systems that, at least in a wide range of tasks, can match or exceed human capabilities? Do you think that's likely to come in the next decades even?
Maybe. I think certainly for some industries and some kinds of tasks, like
Mm,
that's arguably already happening. So I think
right.
certainly for some
Yeah.
kinds of tasks, but could you have a single model that could do almost everything? Um, I'm not sure. I think
Mhm.
within our lifetime, so you and I are still fairly young, so within the next like 50 years, say, I think there's a decent chance. I mean, there's a lot of things that could go wrong aside from just the progress of technology as well. So, like, I want to hedge what I'm saying with that in mind too. I mean, we could just see economic collapse or
Right. Something that stops the more general progress of technology that's outside it, like,
yeah, yeah.
you know, like war or
We
strike or any of those things.
sure all kinds of things can happen. We're talking about like a 50,
Yes.
60 year time
Sure.
span.
Sure. Sure.
But if nothing like that happens, and that's a big if, yeah, I think it's possible that within our lifetimes we could start to see models that are like that.
If
Maybe.
I asked you, Alex, I think that's a really reasonable response, and I know that these things are hard to say, and it's really healthy, I think, to get some thoughts that are counter to this, or counter to some of the people who are making more aggressive predictions. If I had, we'll make this as simple and quantified as possible. If I had to give you, I've got an even money bet for you. So we're betting a buck, and you're going to get $2 if you're right, and lose your buck if you're wrong. And you've got to pick a year where something where most experts would consider it AGI, or by some reasonable test it's AGI. It's the year before, you're betting before or after this year. So roughly it's like this, by this date we've got a better than 50% shot to get there. Is there a year that you would make that bet on?
Oh man. Uh, I mean, literally no, but I can play the game.
Yeah.
I think like, and again, like this is really hard to say, and
Yeah,
there are
for sure.
probably a lot of other experts that are more qualified than I am with a broader understanding of
Sure.
technology and the stuff that's going on under the hood. Um, but I don't know, somewhere along the lines of like 2050, 2060, like
Yeah.
that kind of
So
range
you're
is what I
expecting a much longer time frame, at least on an even money bet. So we're in 2022, you're expecting, 30, 40 years still. And I guess it is worth digging into that. Is it, are you mostly hedging it because you just don't see the path from here to there? Are there very specific, I know you've called out some, but I just want to be as explicit as we can. Are there really specific things you're like, this is going to be a really big blocker for a long time? Or you just don't see the runway? Is there what's your kind of logic for why 30, 40 years and not
yeah.
2 or 5 or 1,000 years?
Well, for the most part, the technology that we have today, the models that we have are not really, I would say, are not really a direct stepping stone on the way to
Mm,
AGI. Um,
mm,
I think what we will ultimately need is something that is different, just fundamentally different from how the models that we have today work. Um, I think it will be more similar to an AI that plays video games. Like there's a completely different kind of model
right.
that can look at a game that it's never seen before, and with some uh, uh, human assistance to just set up the loss function and
And
explain
that's an
what's expected,
interesting.
it can figure out how to play the game that it's never seen before. Like I think what we'll need is closer to that than it is to something like GPT.
That's really interesting. So that's a really good way to think here. So you're looking at large language models, and while they demonstrate some really impressive abilities, you don't see that, the at least the short term extrapolation of that leading to really fully intelligent systems or AGI systems. You think, yeah, those kind of more, correct me if I'm wrong, but agent like, moving through a world type systems
Yeah.
like you see in video games. And that's interesting because obviously we've seen some examples of that. The one that I know best is the Dota model
Yep.
from OpenAI, which was
Yep.
a fairly open-ended game, and it really did struggle. And there were multi-agent kind of both AI playing against AI and AI learning from humans, lots of different things done. But it did ultimately get to a pretty good level, and I forget exactly, if you know, definitely say so, how good they got, if they're actually better than the best human players or just as good. But they got to pretty good. What do you think about the extrapolation of those kind of systems that places like OpenAI and others are working on?
Yeah, so it's the Dota 2 AI is also the one that I'm more familiar with and remember
Mm,
reading about. It has been a while. Um, my the last thing that I remember reading is that their AI can beat the best Dota 2 players in the world
okay. Okay.
consistently, but with some limitations. So they disabled some features of the game. They limited the
Right.
number of heroes that were available.
Mm.
They're the kind of limitations that don't make me think it's impossible for a Dota 2 AI to ever surpass those limitations.
I
Like I
would
think they
love
would.
to
Yeah.
know why they did that. Like, I wonder, like, what was it? Was the world just too open, or did it not work? Was there like a way they couldn't get the input data right for their reinforcement learning model? Or I wonder why they took those specific things out.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and it's been a while since I read the
Hmm.
uh, blog post about it. But
Yeah.
I think if I remember correctly, OpenAI also took a similar model and did things like applied it to games that it's never seen before. And that involves like looking at a virtual screen, figuring out what the different elements are, relearning what the inputs to the game are. Like if you think about an AI interacting with the world, that's more similar to the kinds of things that it would have to do compared to GPT, where GPT like it only does text. There's no way really to make that architecture understand new kinds of input or to have different kinds of output. Um,
Unless you convert to text. I mean, which we do, by
yeah,
the way. There's a lot of really interesting cognition in the human brain that happens through language as the medium. I'm struggling to think of some off the top of my head. Maybe I'll think of it as I'm talking. But like people like Noam Chomsky have kind of done a lot of interesting research into how powerful language is as a pathway to more reasoning, more symbolic. Things like maths and philosophy and things that have used language as a halfway point. So,
mhm.
but yeah, but still, your point is still well made. That obviously there's a lot more to the world than text.
Yeah, and then one other thing that I want to mention is like we would need a new way to think about training these models
Mm,
because like I think I mentioned how ChatGPT and GPT-3, you can't really teach them new things as an end user just by using the text interface. And
Yes.
they have
Yeah.
very limited memory of what you've talked about so far. I mean, ChatGPT has actually pretty impressive memory compared to the preceding models, but still, like, if you close the chat window, it has no idea, like, that conversation is completely gone. It can't recall things that you talked about previously.
Right. It
And
has a little bit of that kind of memory, but it's not actually going back into the bigger model.
yeah, yeah. And so they used reinforcement learning during the training process for ChatGPT, where they had human evaluators who would chat with it and score it. But that capability of doing reinforcement learning is not exactly exposed to us as an end user, probably for good reason.
Yeah, probably.
Probably probably
There's
concerns
probably
about.
some malicious things you could
Yeah,
do.
yeah, that or even just completely breaking the model. Like, not too hard with fine tuning to make a model like unlearn something that it knew previously. Like, I actually ran into this a lot with Stable
Bit of
Diffusion.
so yeah, we talk a lot about AI creating disinformation, but maybe we can feed it disinformation as well.
Sure, but like not even intentionally. Like
Sure, yeah, not necessarily maliciously. It can just be accidental or yeah.
so like one thing you can do with Stable Diffusion is you can, because the model is open source, you can download it and do fine tuning, and you can train it to identify new objects. So you can have new word embeddings for objects that it's never seen before. So you could have a person's face or a type of fruit or whatever. And if you do this fine tuning process, it will. One thing that can happen is it can learn to identify this new object at the cost of forgetting about other objects
Interesting.
because your
Sounds like
training
me.
corpus. Yeah, sure. So like if you train with a face, like your face, it will start making all humans have that face.
So
Uh,
funny. It's funny
it's kind of
because I
interesting.
can't, I can't, and look, this is a whole nother topic, so we won't dive into it now. But there are so many things that can happen with these more general uh, AI systems that remind me of humans. That we
Yeah,
do this. You're like, I want to buy that car, and all of a sudden on the road, all you see is that car. Or there's the anchoring effects. You mention something, and then every question you get asked after that, you're always biased towards answering it. But I want to ask you a little bit about how you think these things will play out from a societal impact perspective. How do you see the future playing out over, say, the next couple of decades at least, um, in terms of how these things affect society? Do you see it being positive, and how do you see it being positive or negative?
yeah. I think there's a lot to consider, and I'm glad that you brought it up because at the very least, it's a question that we should all try to be conscious of.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, I think undoubtedly today we have some transformative models that have come out in the last couple of years that have enormous capacity for both positive and negative impact.
hmm
Um, we talked a lot already about the positives and some of the use cases and how it can accelerate human work, but just some examples of what can happen on the negative side with the models that we have today, and then we can maybe extrapolate. Um, Models like GPT can reinforce existing biases. Uh, and this can happen in a lot of different ways. First of all, like the corpus it's trained on all text on the internet, and some portion of that text is bias. And there's some vile, like
well, it's the internet.
horrible
Every
things on the internet.
it's the internet. Like, enough
Yeah.
said, right?
So now, to their credit, like OpenAI puts a lot of effort into filtering the corpus and trying to address this problem head on. But it's almost impossible to be 100% effective at that. So you can do things like ask leading questions and have it spit back answers that confirm your existing bias as a human. Um, you could have it pull from sources of information in the corpus that are just themselves biased or incorrect or misinformation.
Well, and I
Um,
think this question of bias is a really interesting one because also bias is a matter of definition. One person's bias is another person's intuition, and the internet is just full of the words of every human and their generations in for the last 30, 40 years. But
yeah,
yes, you're
that's
absolutely
true.
correct that this has real chance to create the kinds of social impact that we don't want and have fought against for a long time and think we're moving away from. So the risks are real. What are your thoughts about things beyond bias, other kind of failure modes or risks?
Yeah, well, I think disrupting the capacity of these models to disrupt certain industries is also definitely something worth talking about and thinking about. A lot of people um, now, I have some friends who are digital artists. So a lot of people are concerned about models like Stable Diffusion and Dolly and what it means to be an artist in a world where an AI can spit out, hundreds, thousands of paintings that look pretty good in seconds, in minutes.
100%.
And my view of things today is like, yeah, there are going to be there is some work that is going to be displaced by AI. Think it's already starting to happen. Um, the good thing is that now, for now at least, I think the best way to think about these models is that they work best in conjunction with human input. So if you're an artist, you can potentially use things like Dolly and Stable Diffusion to accelerate your workflows. If you're a programmer, I already talked about how you can use Copilot to accelerate your workflows. And I don't think that today Copilot Copilot cannot replace programmer completely. And I think also the AI art generators cannot replace
The
artists
same thing.
completely.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
still, I understand why it can be scary. And there are also a lot of legal questions that need to be answered about
Yes, like if you ask something very
copyright and IP.
specific, yeah, if you ask something very specific and it's 3 pixels away from an existing artwork or, two strokes away, is that copyright
Sure.
infringement? It's a valid
Yeah,
question.
yeah. Or even just asking, Dolly to mimic the art style of a specific artist in the
Right.
prompt. Just one artist say, "Hey, draw me this in the style of this artist." Like that's kind of scary, and I don't know
Right.
if that should
And
necessarily be
we
allowed,
we
and how to
have
even prevent it.
we have, precedent for some of these things, right? If I start drawing something in if I could, the style of Pablo Picasso, like, there are probably legal precedents for this sort of thing. But the sheer scale and distribution is a whole other level,
Yeah,
right now. The point is I can't make Pablo Picasso like paintings. The number of people that can, you can probably count on, in jelly beans in a jar. It's not a lot of people. But if everybody on the planet at the blink of an eye can do this, enforcement and things really completely changes. The question around jobs and displacement and de-skilling, I think it's a very relevant one and a very important one, um, that I think society will need to face and solve well. And that doesn't just mean just let it happen. It also means how do we help people transition. But I do think one part of the conversation that's often lost, and not kind of common wisdom, and I'm not really sure why, because I think it's such an important economic and historical point, is all wealth creation is the changing of industries, right? The reason we are not all in the woods, harvesting our own food is because of tools and specialization and the fact that we've been able to make more with less. And I think this can be that as well, at least in terms of the next logical implications. But that doesn't mean we don't need to still help people transition so that wealth creation is equitably and fairly and positively shared in a big society.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. I think that's a really good point. Like, imagine what happens, and this is already kind of starting to happen to an extent when a company or an individual that's wealthy uh, trains or buys a AI model and it makes them more money,
Yeah,
like without any humans in the chain. You just set this AI model loose and it makes money and you expand from there. Like it kind of starts to break down our existing economic systems, which
that's it.
really
That's it.
like depend on humans, and there's a balance that happens because of that. Uh, if you depend on human laborers, they have some sway and some ability to some leverage to argue for their well-being. And if that completely goes away and there's no human laborers in the pipeline for some industries, that is potentially very
I think I
scary and
think
disruptive.
I think that's a really good way to think about it. Is it's less about can we create wealth and output for the world. In fact, if this is useful and we're applying it, you would certainly hope that that's what's happening. And I don't when we use the word wealth, we don't just mean material wealth. It could be greater availability of educational materials and greater availability of healthcare advice. This can be wealth in the broadest sense of people's needs. But you're right, our economic systems have not been designed for, so much change so quickly, particularly as it affects employment and labor markets. So I think that's the part of the conversation that we'll really need to pay a lot of attention to and challenge existing norms to make sure we get to good outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Alex, do you have any last comments, suggestions, thoughts for our listeners? And our listeners, for context, are going to be people who are interested in the future of artificial general intelligence and ensuring that it's a really positive um, outcome for society. And many of them will be technical, some of them will be in policy. What are your any kind of last comments or thoughts for them?
Yeah, I mean, one small thing is go check out Chat GPT. It's completely free to use
Yeah,
right now. And it's not only just fun to play around with. I think it will also help people understand what the strengths and weaknesses are today. Because if you just look on Twitter and you see all these amazing results, like which I don't want to discount, like it can do some very impressive things, but there are also a lot of limitations that we talked about. So I would encourage everybody to just go play around with it. It's fun and you can learn a lot.
I agree. I
Um,
agree. No, it's a great suggestion.
and then yeah, I mean, just more broadly speaking, like everybody should probably be thinking about these problems, some of the larger impacts on society and economic systems. Like, it's kind of something that everybody needs to start thinking about and just be aware of. Yeah, I don't have the answers, but like we don't want to be caught on the back foot. It's gonna be tough.
I agree, and I think one last thing I'll share from my own personal experience with all of this is I think it is really easy. I said there are two kind of big extreme failure modes, and I think lots of people fall into one of the two, and I fall into the two. Is one is you get really negative about this stuff. You go, "Oh my God, it's going to take over the world. It's going to ruin the world," and you just see that, and not only is it negative, but it actually stops you acting in any way. You stop enjoying even today before any of this has happened. So that's not great. And the other way people can often fail with technology is that they apply it blindly or apply it with greed or other kind of selfish motives, or just don't think so fully through the consequences. So I think those are the two extremes we're hopefully trying to stop our audience, including ourselves, from falling into.
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess just one more thing to mention, a bit of a positive
Mm.
side is like if you are listening and you have some interest in machine learning and a bit of a entrepreneurial streak, like take a close look at these new emerging models because I think there's a lot of business opportunity to build, uh, services that are powered by AI models. It's kind of a lot of the things that we talked about today are like very new, a year or 2 years old or less even. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for disruption. And if you do that, try and do it in a positive way. And like keep in
Please
mind
do
some
it
of
in
the
a
things that
positive
we
way.
talked about.
Really try. This is powerful stuff. Thank you so much, Alex, for an amazing conversation and for teaching us all so much. Thank you to our listeners. And the next episode will be similar. We'll be continuing to dive in on timelines with a different expert, with a different set of perspectives to help us understand how we get to AGI, when that might happen, and start to really think about where that might lead us. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks.